They said she bathed in blood, not metaphorically, not in poetry, but truly, naked, expressionless, and crimson warmth still steaming from the veins of murdered girls. 650. That's the number, some whispered. Peasant daughters, maidservants, orphans, lured with the promises, locked in stone chambers, tortured, disfigured, and drained. And at the centre of it all, Countess Elizabeth Báthory. She wasn't a monster in rags. She wore velvet, jewels, titles. You've heard? She spoke Latin, quoted scripture, and walked through corridors that smelled of roses and rot. This isn't a ghost story, this is a historical record. And yet, behind every fact, there's blood that's been wiped clean. Behind every confession, a scream that was never truly heard. Tonight, we revisit the most infamous woman killer in European history, not to glorify her, not to pardon her, but to ask, how does a noble woman become death itself? Let's begin. She was born into power. On a cold August day in 1560, in the Kingdom of Hungary, Elizabeth Báthory entered the world not as a child, but as a legacy. Her name carried centuries of wealth, land, and blood. The Báthory family had bred kings, princes, and warlords. Their crest bore dragons and crosses. Their enemies disappeared. Their allies feared them. The girl would never know hunger, but she would know darkness. Her castle, Exed, rose from the swamp like a fortress against the world. Fog hugged its foundations. The wind moaned through its iron gates like a mourning spirit. Inside, everything was stone, walls, hearts, intentions. It was a place where silence had teeth. From her earliest years, Elizabeth was no ordinary child. She was brilliant. She spoke multiple languages before 10. Latin, German, Hungarian, each word clipped and perfect like shards of glass. She read theology, memorized laws, played instruments with ghostly precision. Her tutors feared her, not because she failed, but because she didn't blink. But brilliance did not protect her from brutality. Hungarian nobility in the 16th century lived in a world soaked in war and superstition. Punishments were public. Torture was common. Executions were entertainment. Children were made to watch. It was considered education. Elizabeth's own family practiced cruelty like a tradition. An uncle dabbled in alchemy and black magic. A cousin was rumoured to be possessed. Servants vanished. Wolves howled outside the castle walls, and no one went looking. She learned early that mercy was weakness, and pain was power. And then came the fits. As a young girl, Elizabeth experienced sudden seizures. She would collapse, foam at the mouth, convulse. Some said epilepsy, others said possession. In that time, such illness was feared as a curse or a divine punishment. Whispers followed her everywhere she went. Whispers that she had inherited something mal, something unholy, from some unknown ancestor. Her mother turned away. Her father locked the doors tighter, and Elizabeth learned to keep her pain inside. They dressed her in brocade and gold, but fear was her real clothing. Fear of her health, fear of what was expected of her, fear of what would happen if she didn't become what the family needed, a ruler, a vessel, a weapon. At 13, she was betrothed to Ferenc Nadasti, a soldier known for impaling prisoners of war. He was older, brutal, absent. Their marriage was political, not personal, but it bound her to the Nadasti estate, where the horrors of Shaita Castle would later unfold. It is here, in this part of her life, where the seeds were planted. A child raised in privilege but fed on fear. A girl taught to command but never to feel. A young woman taught that violence was not just allowed, it was expected. Was she born a monster, or was she made into one? That question will haunt this story like a shadow that never leaves, but what's certain is this: before she became the Blood Countess, before the Scribe and the chains, before the disappearances and the crimson-stained floors, Elizabeth Báthory was a child no one ever truly touched, a mind no one dared to understand, a name that would outlive every other in screams. In 1575, at the age of 15, Elizabeth Báthory became a wife. Her wedding to Count Ferenc Nadasti was no affair of love. It was a transaction, land for land, power for power. Their union brought together two of the most influential noble houses in Hungary. The dowry was immense: estates, villages, castles. Among them, Shaita Castle, a fortress perched on a hill in what is now Slovakia. Ferenc was often absent, riding into battle against the Ottomans. On the battlefield he earned a name, the Black Hero of Hungary. At home he left Elizabeth alone, with the keys, the servants, and full control, and she ruled. Even before Ferent's death, Elizabeth handled the affairs of their vast estates. She oversaw taxes, managed disputes, disciplined servants, judged criminals. In an age when women were expected to obey, she commanded. Her intelligence was sharp, cold, and unquestioned. Locals feared her, respected her, but never truly approached her. The records described her as calculating, efficient, and detached. She rarely smiled. Her letters were exact and formal like blades wrapped in silk. Yet her rule was not just about paper and ink. In a feudal world, the nobles were absolute. Their word was law. Their punishments were theatre. Elizabeth absorbed that culture with quiet fervour. Every infraction from a servant, spilled wine and wrinkled linen, slow footsteps, was a challenge to her control, and she would respond with lessons: whipping, starvation, beatings, public humiliation. At first, these punishments were accepted, expected even. But something changed. Ferenc, known for cruelty in war, began teaching her darker methods. One method, chilling in its simplicity, was nicknamed the Star Kick, rubbing honey on a servant's naked body and leaving her tied in the sun for insects to feast. Another was to drive needles beneath the nails, or to coat feet in oil and set them aflame. These were not whispers. These were passed down in letters, accounts, testimonies, taught, shared, refined. Ferenc and Elizabeth were not two monsters apart, they were a couple forged in brutality, one in armour, one in lace. But Elizabeth went further. While Ferenc was away, she grew more independent. Her influence expanded beyond the estate. She travelled between properties, taking young girls into her service, girls from poor families, girls from nearby villages, girls no one would come looking for. She built a network of loyal servants. Some were midwives. Others were herbalists, former witches, widows cast out by society. They obeyed her without question. She was the Lady of Seta, untouchable, untamed. When Ferenc died in 1604, Elizabeth was only 4, a widow now, and alone, but not weak. She inherited everything: the full estate, the political protections, the servants, the silence, and from this point forward, her cruelty was no longer shared. It became hers alone. The punishments grew stranger. The girl who had once watched others suffer now crafted suffering as an art. Where others stopped at pain, she experimented. Where others punished, she transformed torment into ritual. This was the moment the line blurred. When did discipline become obsession? When did control become cruelty? When did noble blood mix with the blood of the innocent? In the cold corridors of Seta Castle, the questions echoed. But no one dared answer. Not yet. Because Elizabeth Báthory, widow, countess, ruler, was still protected by title, still untouchable, still cloaked in respect and power. But inside the walls, something monstrous was stirring, a hunger that wouldn't be satisfied with fear, only with flesh. It started with Sons. A girl would arrive at the gates of Shekte, young, pale, trembling in the mist. She would bow her head, step inside, and vanish. No one saw her leave, no letters reached her family, no funeral was held, only the sound of horses departing at dawn, carrying carts draped in linen. At first, the villagers said nothing. After all, the Countess had power, and power in those days made you invisible to justice, but silence is fragile. A missing daughter becomes a mother's question. A question becomes a whisper. And a whisper repeated enough becomes a scream too loud to ignore. The castle remained locked, its windows shuttered, but the rumours slipped out like smoke from under the door. She beats the girls for fun. I heard she burned one with iron tongs. My cousin's child went there and never came home. They say she drinks the blood. These weren't tales told by enemies. They came from inside, from former servants, stable boys, chambermaids. Some dismissed, others escaped. One spoke of chains hanging in the basement. Another described a tub filled with something thick and dark. One woman, unnamed in trial documents, claimed she saw a girl sewn shut, her mouth stitched for disobedience. Still, nothing was done. Why? Because Elizabeth was noble, because the peasants were not, because justice bowed to bloodlines. She had friends in high places, relatives in court, allies among the aristocracy, even connections to the Habsburgs. She paid her taxes. She lent money to kings. Who would dare accuse her? And yet, inside her estate, the cruelty intensified. Girls brought in as maids or students were subjected to punishments so gruesome that later witnesses wept as they recalled them. Some were beaten with clubs until their bones snapped. Others were stripped, starved, and left outside in winter. Several were reported to have needles driven beneath their fingernails. Many simply disappeared. There were no records, only bloodstains, cleaned and re-cleaned. Only shawms, muffled by thick walls and heavy doors. Then came the academy. Under the pretense of education, Elizabeth began accepting daughters of minor nobility into her service. Not peasants, gentry. And that changed everything. One girl sent to learn etiquette never returned. Her body was returned in a coffin with no explanation. Another was said to have fallen ill, but no doctor ever attended. A third vanished entirely, and this time people noticed. The aristocracy had turned its gaze inward. Whispers turned to letters. Letters turned to investigations. The veil was thinning. But still, Château Castle stood proud, its towers scraping the sky, its banners fluttering in false peace. Inside, Elizabeth remained calm, composed, untouchable. She attended church. She hosted dinners. She sent cordial notes to lords and bishops. Her handwriting, elegant and neat, never trembled. She was still the Lady of Chaiti. But behind her eyes, something had changed. It wasn't just discipline. It wasn't even revenge. It was something colder, ritualistic, detached, surgical. She had begun to treat bodies like canvas, pain like pigment, blood like ink, and the castle became her workshop. The maids, the servants, the students, they were no longer people. They were offerings, objects, answers to a question only she could hear, a question whispered in her own mind. What will keep me young forever? It was still just a rumour, just a legend, they said, that she bathed in blood to preserve her beauty, but legends are born from somewhere, and within those walls, the truth began to clot. It began with a drop. One girl, nameless, faceless, made the mistake of brushing the Countess's hair too roughly. A tug, a snap, a handful of strands torn loose. Elizabeth struck her, hard. The girl's nose bled. It splattered onto Elizabeth's hand, and something strange happened. Later that night, Elizabeth studied her skin in the mirror. Where the blood had touched, it looked smoother, firmer, younger. That, at least, is how the story goes. Was it true, or was it myth born from horror? The detail is still debated, but what came after, the pattern of violence, the nature of the wounds, the obsessive targeting of young peasant girls, all of it points to a terrifying belief that youth could be bought with blood, and Elizabeth paid in flesh. The transformation was gradual. What began as cruelty, punishment, control, shifted into something ritualistic. She began selecting victims not for their disobedience, but for their purity. Teenage girls, virgins, the unspoiled, the unblemished. She believed their blood held something sacred, something that could reverse time, delay decay, feed the rot she felt in her bones. Her servants assisted. Ilona Jo, her longtime maid and companion. Dorothea Sentes, known for her cold efficiency, Catelyn Benica, the Silent One, and a mysterious figure named Anna Darvulia, an older woman rumoured to be a witch, herbalist and dark advisor to the Countess. It was Darvulia, they said, who introduced the baths, wooden tubs filled after beatings, warmed by the body heat of the freshly slain. Elizabeth would step in slowly, breathing in steam laced with iron and fear. She believed this would cleanse her of age. She believed this would preserve her power. Outside the castle, famine gripped the land. War ravaged Hungary. Villages burned. Fathers sold their daughters for bread, and Elizabeth, seated in her tower, welcomed them in with false kindness. Some girls were paid, others were promised employment, all were promised safety, none returned whole. Inside the walls they were stripped, inspected, measured. Some were forced to sing, others were whipped in time to music, some were cut open slowly, and their blood collected in bowls. One girl, a witness later said, was forced to cook and eat her own flesh. Testimonies from the eventual trial, some still preserved, described torture methods beyond comprehension. Burning with red-hot coins, sewing of lips and eyes, freezing naked in snow then dousing with water. insertion of sharp objects into places too cruel to name, and always the draining. Blood pooled, blood washed, blood offered. To Elizabeth, blood became a kind of currency, a medium of beauty, a declaration of power, an answer to the fear that had haunted her since childhood, the fear of decay, of death. She no longer saw girls, she saw youth, bottled in veins. Outside she still smiled. She wrote letters in Latin, attended mass, donated to monasteries. But inside she was unravelling. Every new wrinkle brought panic, every stray grey hair sent her into rage. She demanded more girls, younger, cleaner, more fresh, as if death itself could be postponed if only the sacrifice was pure enough. And Chester Castle became a tomb, not a fortress of defence but of collection, of hunger, of rot beneath roses. Still, no one came, because she was noble, because she had the money, because the blood of peasants didn't matter. Not yet. By now it was no longer punishment. It was no longer correction. It had become design. Each act of cruelty followed a pattern, each death a rehearsal for the next. Elizabeth Báthory no longer reacted. She planned. Each girl who entered Chester Castle became part of a ritual. The castle itself transformed. No longer just a seat of nobility, it was a theatre of agony. Chambers were sealed, walls thickened, iron rings installed. One room held whips, another, razors, branding irons and chains. There were rumours of a cage suspended from the ceiling, lined with spikes on the inside. When lowered, the girl inside would be torn apart by her own weight. She called it cleansing, she called it restoration. But what she did was methodical dissection, body by body, scream by scream. Witnesses later spoke of a particular sequence. First, the girl would be stripped, not only of clothing but of dignity. Elizabeth would pace around her, inspecting her like livestock. A bruise? Too less damaged. A scar? Not pure enough. But if the girl cried, trembled, begged, then the ritual could begin. She would start with small wounds, needles beneath the nails, bites, real, with her own teeth, to tear skin from the shoulders, then escalation. Her favourite was fire, red-hot metal pressed to the face, the breasts, the inner thighs. Another method was freezing, forcing girls to stand in snow until their flesh cracked, then pouring water over their frozen bodies like glass sculptures set to shatter. And she didn't always do it alone. Her servants, Ilona, Dorothea, Catalin, assisted with terrifying devotion. One held the arms, one read out prayers. Another, often Anna d'Arvulia, stood silent, watching the timing, measuring the flow. If the blood flowed too fast, the ritual ended too soon. If it flowed too slowly, the Countess grew angry. And when the girl finally collapsed, torn, burned, spent, Elizabeth would kneel beside her, dip her fingers in the warmth and smear it across her face like balm. Sometimes she laughed, sometimes she wept, but always she returned to the mirror, returned to the belief that what she had done had meaning, that death had gifted her something eternal. Outside, Chester Castle remained pristine. Courtyards swept, tapestries changed, letters went out with delicate wax seals. To visitors, Elizabeth was reserved, polite, even gracious, but no one saw the rooms below. One chamber had walls blackened by soot from burnt skin. Another stank of rot despite layers of lavender and herbs scattered on the floor. The servants who cleaned it never spoke again, and the girls kept coming, peasants first, then orphans, then daughters of the lesser gentry, some sold by families, some lured by letters promising education, work or patronage. And the Countess kept count. One ledger, later discovered, listed names, initials, ages, over 600 entries. Was it real? Was it forged by her enemies after her fall? Historians are divided, but the testimonies, many of them sworn under torture themselves, suggest she had grown proud of the number, as if the mass of suffering she caused was an achievement. She no longer feared war. She believed herself above time, above pain, above the fate of mortals. She was not a woman anymore, not to herself. She had become something else, a symbol, a hunger, a force carved into bone and ash. And still, no one came, because the cries of peasant girls did not echo far enough, because those in power turned their faces away, because monsters wear silk too. The castle no longer echoed with laughter. It howled, not from wind, but from suffering. By the early 1600s, Elizabeth Báthory had built something far worse than a legend. She had built an empire, not of stone or soldiers, but of pain. Every hallway in Château led to darkness, every servant knew their role, every stram had its place. She no longer needed secrecy, torture became routine. Girls arrived weekly, some led in blindfolded, others gagged from the start. Those who resisted were beaten unconscious before the Countess even saw them. She didn't hide the rituals anymore. They took place in daylight. Sometimes in the courtyard, sometimes in the great hall under painted ceilings once meant for noble feasts. Visitors reported strange smells, ash, mould, metal, the stench of something dying over and over again. But Elizabeth greeted them graciously. She wore white gloves, she served wine, she offered tours of the garden, and her skin, remarkably smooth for her age, glowed beneath the sun. No one asked questions, no one dared. And still, the deaths multiplied. Witnesses described rows of bodies buried behind the stables. Others were burned in secret at night. Some were cut into pieces and buried under floorboards. One servant recalled a pit behind the castle, shallow, hastily dug, reeking of lime and secrets. The Countess had become a collector of silence. She kept souvenirs, rings, locks of hair, blood-stained cloth folded neatly like relics, each one a reminder of control, each one a denial of mortality. And then the sickness grew systemic. She opened a so-called finishing school for young noblewomen. On the surface, it offered language lessons, etiquette, music. In reality, it was a supply chain, a revolving door of victims. Some students returned home traumatized, others never returned at all. Parents began to whisper, first behind hands, then behind doors. The nobility had tolerated the loss of peasant girls. But now their own daughters were missing, and yet Elizabeth didn't stop. She had passed the point of caution. Her rituals became grander, longer, more elaborate. One girl was reportedly sewn into the belly of a dead horse. Another was suspended upside down and bled for hours. Her blood collected in jars for the Countess's bath. Even her servants began to falter. Ilona, once loyal, now hesitated. Dorothea grew erratic, drunk, paranoid, violent, panic without command. Catalin begged to leave, but was threatened into silence. Anna d'Arvilliers, her dark guide, grew ill and died around this time. Some say Elizabeth poisoned her to prevent betrayal. Others say the devil simply took back what was his. Without d'Arvilliers, the Countess's mind unravelled further. She believed herself cursed. She saw ghosts, she talked to mirrors, she became obsessed with numbers, 600, 650. How many lives would it take? She wrote lists, marked names, some she crossed out with red ink, others with blood. She was no longer trying to preserve youth, she was trying to defy death itself. The bodies stacked higher. The castle stank of rot even in winter. Snow turned pink near the servant quarters. Dogs were seen digging in shallow graves. The empire of pain was collapsing under its own weight. But Elizabeth didn't see it. She still held banquets, still wrote letters to kings, still ordered new dresses, new perfume, new girls, because she believed she was eternal, because she believed no one could touch her, because for decades she had been right. But justice moved slowly, and now, finally, it had begun to stir. It was a nobleman who broke the silence. In late 1610, a letter arrived at the court of King Matthias II. It was brief, cautious, but unmistakably urgent. There are too many missing girls, too many closed coffins, and too many parents silenced by money. The sender was Istvan Magyar, a Lutheran minister. He had heard the rumours for years. He had seen the funerals with sealed lids. He had comforted mothers who received no bodies, only apologies. This time the whispers had reached someone who could not ignore them. King Matthias hesitated. Elizabeth Báthory was no peasant. She was cousin to Prince Gabor Báthory of Transylvania. Her family had loaned money to the crown. She owned more land than most barons. To accuse her was to risk war within the aristocracy. But the deaths were no longer silent. Even members of the lower nobility were reporting losses. Daughters vanished, letters unanswered, payments offered and refused. Too many coincidences, too many closed doors. So the king turned to a man he trusted, György Thurzó, a high-ranking palatine, politician, judge, and, crucially, a man with personal ties to the Báthory family. Thurzo was ordered not to act hastily, not to make noise, to gather information quietly. And so he did. He sent spies into the village. He interviewed former servants. He cross-referenced names of the dead. He didn't find one or two incidents. He found dozens, stories that matched, methods that repeated, witnesses who had never met but described the same rooms, the same screams, the same smell of scorched flesh and cheap perfume. It was no longer a rumour. It was a pattern. In December 1610, Thurzo wrote to the king, "There is more blood here than I imagined." But still, no arrest, because Elizabeth was powerful, because the law did not move with justice, it moved with calculation. Thurzo needed certainty, proof, witnesses, and so, on December 29th, under the cover of snow, he made his move. He rode to Cheste Castle with a small armed escort. No warning, no invitation. They entered quietly, the gates opened. The halls were still. What they found inside, even Thurzo would struggle to describe. A girl lay dead near the door, freshly killed. Another was barely alive, naked, trembling, her eyes glazed. In the lower chambers, they found 3 more, chained, bleeding, waiting for their turn. Rooms were soaked in blood, tools lay extirpated. Iron tongs, whips, knives, black with rot. And a book, a single book filled with names, over 600, written in Elizabeth's own hand. She was arrested on the spot. She said nothing, not a word. She stood tall, elegant, expressionless, as if this were a misunderstanding, as if they were the ones who had crossed a line. Thurzo ordered the survivors freed, the wounded taken to care, the bodies counted, but he knew this was only the beginning, because now the world would see what had been allowed to grow in silence, because now, finally, the Countess could no longer hide behind mirrors and lace. She would not face the stake, she would not hang, but the trial to come would tear through her legacy like a fire through dry silk. And justice, however delayed, had begun its descent. The castle had turned cold, not from winter, but from abandonment. After the raid, the hallways of Chete stood quiet, not with secrecy, but with exposure. The portraits remained on the walls, the tapestries hung untouched, but the illusion had crumbled. The Countess of Blood had been caught, and now the world would begin to dig. Elizabeth Báthory was never brought to trial, not because she was innocent, but because her bloodline was too powerful. To place a woman of her stature in open court would shame the entire Hungarian nobility. It would reveal that silence had been bought for decades, and that her crimes were committed not in the shadows, but under the passive gaze of those who could have stopped her. So instead, her servants were tried in January 1611, Ilona, Dorothea, Catalin, and others. And when they spoke, the walls of the courtroom seemed to bend from the weight of what they revealed. They confessed to everything, to luring girls with lies, to torturing them under the Countess's orders, to burning, slicing, starving, sewing mouths shut, stuffing girls into boxes with nails driven inward. One spoke of Elizabeth biting a girl's face until the cheekbone shattered. Another recalled the sound of bones cracking like wet wood beneath iron rods. Some wept, some shook with guilt. Others described the acts with deadened voices, as if they no longer understood the meaning of horror. And in the centre of it all, always, Elizabeth, calm, watching, commanding, not once lifting a finger, but orchestrating every scream with the precision of a conductor. The court believed the testimonies, because they matched, because the wounds were real, because too many graves had been uncovered. The official count of victims was set at 80, but the whispered number remained 650, and then came the punishment. Dorothea and Ilona had their fingers torn out with red-hot pincers before being burned alive. Catalin, believed to have acted under duress, was imprisoned for life. The others were hanged, and the castle, once a seat of elegance and terror, was emptied. But what of Elizabeth? She was never tortured, never publicly humiliated, never shackled in chains. Instead, she was sentenced to house arrest, confined to a single windowless room in her own castle. The walls were sealed. A small slit allowed food to pass, no visitors, no letters, no mirrors, just stone. And time, the very 2 things she had tried to defeat. She remained there for 4 years. In the beginning she paced, she murmured to herself. She asked for her servants, for her comb, for her gowns, but no one answered. Later she stopped eating, then stopped speaking. On the night of August 21st, 1614, her guard peered through the slit and saw her lying motionless on the floor, still dressed in the remnants of her former wealth. Elizabeth Báthory was dead. At 54 years old, alone, untried, unrepentant, her body was buried quickly, secretly. Some say it was moved, hidden, desecrated. Today, no one knows exactly where she lies, because history did what it always does to the inconvenient. It buried her, but it could not forget her. The name Báthory lived on, not in honour but in myth, not in legacy but in strethems retold through generations. She was no longer just a countess, she became a symbol of evil, of cruelty hidden behind lace, of what happens when power grows teeth and no one dares pull them out. They tried to erase her. After her death, the name Elizabeth Báthory became an embarrassment, a stain on the nobility, a mark of shame on the Hungarian crown, a dark shadow on centuries of aristocratic pride. Her family moved swiftly. Portraits were taken down, records were burned. The grave, wherever it was left unmarked. She was not given a funeral fit for a countess, no songs and no mourning bells, only silence. In official histories, she was reduced to a footnote, a widow, a recluse, a woman who died quietly at home, but truth is not so easily buried. Villagers remembered. Survivors spoke in hushed voices, and over time the silence rotted, not into forgetfulness, but into legend. It began with stories, told around fires, in taverns on stormy nights. The Lady of Szekely drank the blood of virgins. She bathed in it every full moon. She sold her soul for eternal beauty. She still walks the halls of the castle, searching for her next victim. Fact and fiction blurred. In the 18th and 19th centuries, her tale resurfaced, this time in books. Writers, craving horror, reached for her name. She was no longer Elizabeth Báthory, Hungarian countess. She became the Blood Countess, the female Dracula, and just like that she was immortalized, not by truth, but by fear. In some versions, she's a vampire. In others, a sorceress. In most, she is stripped of her complexity, no longer a noblewoman moulded by abuse and power, but a monster born evil. What they couldn't silence, they turned into spectacle. Szekely Castle became a curiosity. People came to stare at the ruins, to touch the stone where blood once dried, to walk where girls once screamed. Tourists whispered her name as if it might still summon her. Artists painted her surrounded by corpses. Authors imagined her bathing in crimson like a goddess of death. Filmmakers turned her into myth, her crimes exaggerated, her motives twisted into vanity alone. And yet, something remains, something colder than fiction. The trial records, the testimonies, the missing daughters, the fear etched into old letters, the matching details from those who never met but remembered the same screams. Because while some historians argue she was framed, a woman too powerful, brought down by men afraid of her wealth, the weight of the evidence crushes that theory under its own gore. Too many bodies, too many patenons, too many witnesses who had nothing to gain by lying. She may not have bathed in blood, but she spilled it, over and over. She may not have sought immortality through magic, but she hunted it, through death. And what does it mean that we remember her not for her lands, her language, her intelligence, but for her cruelty? It means the erasure failed. Elizabeth Báthory is more famous now than she ever was in life. Her name conjures images of torture, decadence, and the price of unchecked power. She was supposed to disappear, but monsters, once born, do not die easily. They linger, in stone, in screams, in mirrors where we look at history and see ourselves. So what was she, truly? A noblewoman moulded by trauma? A sadist unbound by law? A monster of myth or a mirror of her time? History doesn't always offer clarity. It offers scars. Elizabeth Báthory lived in a world where pain was public and blood was justice. Where women were used, traded, silenced, unless they learned to hold the whip themselves. She did. And then she went further. She mastered control. She commanded fear. She turned suffering into ritual, cold, clinical, efficient. Some say she was framed. That her lands were envied. That her downfall was political. That men could not bear a wealthy, educated widow with too much power. Maybe there's truth in that. But power alone doesn't explain blood. It doesn't explain broken bodies or mute witnesses or pits behind castles. Politics may silence a voice, but it doesn't create hundreds of graves. The horror of Elizabeth Báthory is not in the legend. It's in the records. in the patterns, in the chilling bureaucratic way she wrote down the names of the girls as if logging receipts, as if life was something you spent. She wasn't a vampire, she didn't need to be. She was a noble, educated, protected, and in that protection she learned she could erase consequences, that a scream behind a stone wall meant nothing if the crown still bowed. What terrifies me most is not the idea that she was uniquely evil, but that she may not have been rare, that for every castle like Shade, there were others, without witnesses, without trials, without names. She is remembered not because she was the only one, but because she was one of the few who left behind a trail too bloodied to ignore. Her name has become myth, but the truth is more brutal than fiction. Elizabeth Báthory was human. And perhaps that is the true horror. Because if a human being, born with privilege, gifted with intelligence, surrounded by culture, can transform cruelty into habit, pain into art, death into routine, then what does that say about the world that made her? And about us?